I'm Peter Mayers. My day job is presenting the National Interest on ABC Radio National. I'm also a member of the advisory committee of the Festival of Ideas, so I get to come every couple of years back to my hometown of Adelaide, which is a great treat for me. Today, a conversation about the way government works, looking at the relationship between ministers and public servants, at how we keep the bastards honest, and at how advocates for a particular cause might seek to influence policy without resorting to paying thousands of dollars to sit next to the Prime Minister at a fundraising dinner or lending him a second-hand utility. I'm in the elegant Benithan Hall at the University of Adelaide together with four guests who each bring a unique perspective to government processes. Jeff Gallop is a former Premier of Western Australia, so he has direct experience of setting policy and directing public servants to carry it out. But Jeff Gallop also brings an analytical approach to these issues as a Professor of Politics and Director of the Graduate School of Government at Sydney University. Professor Jeff Gallop, welcome to the National Interest and the Festival of Ideas.
Thank you.
Our second panellist has been on the receiving end of ministerial direction for much of his life. Dr. Peter Shergold had a distinguished career in the Commonwealth Public Service, heading various agencies and departments under governments of different stripes, and ending at the top of the bureaucratic tree for 5 years as the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the most senior job in public administration in Australia. Peter Shergold, welcome.
Thank you.
And I should add that Dr. Shergold, like Jeff Gallop, has now moved from the halls of power, the corridors of power that should be, shouldn't it? The corridors of power to the halls of academe. He's a professor in the Australian School of Business at the University of New South Wales and Foundation Chair of the Centre for Social Impact, which is looking at research on social enterprises and corporate social responsibility. Our third guest spent 12 years trying to throw more light on the processes of government, particularly through the Senate estimates procedures. Natasha Stott-Despoja was a Democrat Senator for South Australia from 1995 to 2008, having been the youngest woman to ever enter the Commonwealth Parliament. She's an honorary visiting research fellow here at the University of Adelaide. Natasha Stott-Despoja, welcome.
Thank you, Peter.
And our fourth guest is Dr. Alex Wodak, Director of the Alcohol and Drug Service at Sydney's St Vincent Hospital since 1982, and a prominent campaigner for reform on drugs policy, which I suspect is a pretty frustrating row to hoe if you're knocking on political doors in Canberra or indeed any state capital. Alex Wodak, welcome.
Thank you.
In the 1980s, the BBC TV series Yes Minister depicted a system of government in which guileless politicians were led by the nose by wily civil servants. Civil servants determined to maintain their own control over policy. 2 decades later, or 2.5 perhaps, it appears that power may have shifted. The Hollow Men on ABC TV showed politicised backroom staffers determining what happens. Their only measurement of success, a spike in the opinion polls. So, Jeff Gallop, does this shift in the nature of satire from Yes Minister to the Hollow Men, does this actually tell us something about the changes that have taken place in the operation of government, do you think?
Well, I think I'm going to start by making an academic point, which will be the last one I make today, and that is that there's a real difference between government in the United Kingdom and government in Australia, which is partly the reason for the difference between Yes Minister and the Hollow Men. In Britain today, there are very few ministerial advisors working within the offices of government. And secondly, it's a much more federal cabinet system. The British cabinet meets very briefly every week. It doesn't meet as a cabinet does in Australia. In fact, the Australian cabinet system is more Westminster than Westminster. And what that means is all of those ministers are out there in their departments with their public servants, with very small ministerial offices, and the whole relationship between the minister and the departmental head has a lot more resonance in the United Kingdom. That being said, there's no doubt that Hollow Men has picked up on an important feature of modern Australian politics. From 1972, we've seen the creation of ministerial offices. It started off, of course, when the Whitlam government came into power with the perception that the public service was against it, having, of course, been operating under the previous regime for over 20 years, that the government was a reform government, it wanted to drive change, and, of course, this system was then replicated throughout the states. We now have a very strong system of ministerial offices. What happens in those ministerial offices is important to government. We've seen in recent times quite an important debate about the extent of transparency. There was the famous McMullen doctrine, of course, that ministerial officers would not appear before federal parliamentary committees, and I'm sure Natasha would remember that very well. And the government of the day used them as a shield in terms of what they were doing or not doing or had done or hadn't done. And I think that represented a real accountability gap in Australian politics. So my overall perception of the Hollow Men is that it picks up on a reality. It exaggerates it, obviously, as all of those comedy programs do. It's a brilliant way of looking at what happens within government. It needs to be looked at alongside the frontline program. We've got to make sure that we realise that there's a relationship here. The Hollow Men only exist because the media exists. The media exists, the Hollow Men exist. They feed off each other in terms of the way politics works. Ministers need ministerial offices. They need the support they get personally. They need the support they get in terms of advice. They need the support they get in terms of the overall political relationships that they have. But if ministers believe and governments believe that all wisdom lies within ministerial offices, I think they're running on the basis of a serious mistake. All governments need a plurality of advice. They need advice coming through from their public service. They'll need advice coming through from external sources. And when government gets locked into the hollow man type reality, I think Australia's sold short in terms of policy outcomes.
Thank you, Jeff Cullop. Dr. Peter Shergold, did you witness the rise and rise of the ministerial advisor, the political staffer, during your time in the public service?
Well, I did, but I think it was the slow rise and rise. This can be really overdone. I mean, I think there is... I mean, I found both Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister and the Hollow Men very funny. But it is a different program and it reflects the changes that have taken place. If you think about Yes Minister, it is essentially between the Minister or the Prime Minister and the Chief Public Servant. In effect, what you have with the Hollow Men and the growth of the Ministerial Advisor is sort of Bernard starting to play the key role in the comedy. And I don't know. I do think that the humour in Yes Prime Minister is more subtle, and the humour in Hollow Men with the Ministerial Advisors is more belly laughs, and I suspect that reflects the nature of the people involved. It is true that there has been a growth in the importance of ministerial advisors who are appointed. In fact, I think it started at the state level. In fact, it started in South Australia. It was Don Dunstan, who was very suspicious of the public service he was inheriting, worried whether it would give him the support that he wanted to drive a new political agenda, and started to bring in political advisors, and then Gough Whitlam did the same at the federal level. But to put it in perspective, when I was serving the Prime Minister, in policy terms, I had a department of about 500 people, and there were 10 to 12 policy advisors, politically appointed policy advisors in the Prime Minister's office, and a handful of media advisors. So I think we can overdo the extent to which it is the political advisors driving the policy.
But if I can interrupt, though, those 10 or 12, that handful of political advisors in the Prime Minister's office, they are much closer in everyday terms to the PM than the 500 public servants in your department, in terms of access.
Yeah, they probably are closer. They sit alongside the Prime Minister. In fact, one of the good things, I think, in Australia is that the political advisors are clearly distinguished from the public servants, and that actually isn't the case in the United Kingdom. At senior levels, you have civil servants who are politically appointed, but unless you're in the know, you wouldn't know. And Jeff is right, ministers sit with their departments. Here, ministers sit separate from their departments and the policy advisors, the politically appointed, sit with the minister. So it is clear, and you're appointed under different legislation. So I think it is a much more transparent division of powers than probably exists in the UK.
Natasha Stott-Despoja, you spent 12 years in Canberra in the Senate observing the political process. Who was holding the power?
Well, I'm surprised to hear that The Hollowman is actually a satirical comedy. I thought it was a documentary. So I think I was actually fortunate years ago to sit down with the Working Dog guys, the creators of Hollowman, and they were picking various politicians' brains about what it was like to be a crossbench politician, because at that time I think they were considering doing a story on, or a series on, a crossbench politician or the life of an independent senator. Clearly that didn't eventuate, so I'm not sure if it's a shift in the exercise of power or just a shift in sort of comic opportunity. Although looking at the Senate now, maybe there are still some comic opportunities available. I think it does reflect an increase in conservatism in Australian politics, and by that I don't mean ideologically necessarily. I mean in terms of a shift towards being risk-averse, where leaders and many politicians campaign less on what they believe and more on what they think will get them elected. And it tends to be very short-term, poll-driven politics, and I think that is something that is evident in Australian politics today. I think that there are many, many opportunities for greater transparency and accountability, and I don't just mean of the executive. I think we have a very powerful executive in Australia, but I think that a lot could be done to ensure greater accountability by politicians generally, ministers, indeed ministerial advisors, and we could perhaps do more to secure the independence of public service.
I have to admit that the team from the Hollowman also interviewed various journalists about their interactions with government as they developed their program series, so I was one of the people they spoke to about. Really, they were interested in the difficulty of getting information as a journalist and the kind of countering the spin that you come up against.
Well, spin versus spin, Peter.
Well,
the media
we can come. We can come back to whether the media is really responsible
we'll get back
for the
to the media,
deficiencies
Jeff. Don't worry.
of the Australian political system in a moment, Jeff. But Alex Wodek, if I can come to you, if you're going to Canberra or indeed to Parliament House or ministerial offices in Sydney to try and influence policy, do you go and see the top bureaucrat? Do you go and see the the minister, or do you go and see the ministerial advisor?
Well, I'll see whoever will accept me, but I don't do a lot of that in that sort of formal sense. Most of my interaction is sort of in informal settings, but I think it's very important to see this whole situation in perspective. I'm probably going to shock a few people in saying what I'm going to say, but I think we have to recognise that government in Australia is, by international comparison standards, remarkably good. That Australia is no Italy and Australia is no United States. Italy's had more than 50 governments since the end of the Second World War, and 10 or 15 years ago, 1 in 6 Italian members of Parliament were facing charges or had been convicted of bribery. Australia's obviously nothing like that, and Australia's nothing like the United States, where George W. Bush has driven the US economy off a cliff, started 2 wars, provided unaffordable tax cuts, and left the country in a terrible mess. Australia, for all the faults we have and the problems we wrestle with, our system of government is much better than that. I think it's also important to look at different models of operating, and the model of operating that I've been very involved in for a quarter of a century now is related to the way AIDS policy was made in Australia. And this was, our political class really did the country proud. Has to be said that we had a bipartisan approach to a problem that was recognised to be very serious, not sure how serious it was going to be and how it was going to unfold, but the politicians did the right thing. We had magnificent work from the senior advisor to the Minister for Health, Bill Botel, a story that really hasn't been told publicly. We had also the Commonwealth Department of Health admitting that it really didn't have the relevant expertise, and the government went outside into the community to get the relevant expertise. We had a partnership approach where the key stakeholders were brought in to government, in effect. So gay men, sex workers, drug users, and so on, sat around the table with police and worked out what to do. And I think it's a terrific model for how we should be approaching problems more and more. So while the 2020 approach is easy to rubbish as a stunt, and maybe it was, I think we should be looking more and more at participatory models, exactly like the AIDS model, because there's no doubt about it, the AIDS model really worked for Australia and saved many lives and saved many billions of dollars.
And Jeff, I want to come now to the point you raised now about the media. We just heard from Alex Wodak an example of, I suppose, policy making at its best. Thoughtful, consultative, engaged, evidence-based, as we hear a lot about these days. Now, from your interjection earlier, you seem to be suggesting that the media is responsible for the kind of policy making at its worst that we see quite often, which is a very short-termist, poll-driven policy response.
Look, I think there are many dimensions to politics, and I think Alex made a very useful contribution there by pointing out a successful Australian initiative, which was world-leading. You've got the dimension of politics where the media people within a ministerial office and within a government are fighting the media, and there's a battle that goes on. It's called the battle over spin, interpretation, how a policy is going to be presented, and quite frankly, both sides are in there playing that game. It's very hard to imagine a political system in the contemporary era without that game going on. But that is not the substance of politics. It's one element of it. Unfortunately, it gets a lot of focus. Unfortunately, a lot of ministers get dragged into it and spend all of their time, starting at 6 a.m. in the morning through to perhaps 6 p.m. at night, engaged in that battle. The other part of politics is where serious proposals are put forward from community groups or from interest groups about initiatives that need to be taken to improve the country, where the public service will come to the government and say, as they did to me when I became Premier in 2001, and said, look, we have a major problem in Western Australia with the declining rainfall levels. I'll never forget the presentation made by our water authorities. This is not a short-term issue. This is a long-term issue. We have to do something about it. And they outlined a strategy which we then followed. So really what I was trying to say there, Peter, is that yes, there is this battle. Hollow Men is a wonderful presentation of an aspect of that battle. I'd urge you all to go back and look at the front line to see the other side of the equation, which is the media part of it. But it's not a description of the comprehensiveness of the political process in Australia. The comprehensiveness includes strong advice from the public service, why a good government would never want to undermine its public servants. But secondly, the comprehensiveness that can come from good advice from the community about what to do in terms of problems. So I think Australian politics is pretty good. It's not so good on the long-term changes, and perhaps that's something we can talk about later on.
Well, you raised a very important point there, which is the one about responsiveness. Obviously, a public service needs to be responsive to the agenda of a government coming into office. I mean, as we discussed earlier with Whitlam and Dunstan, they were both suspicious that they were going to get the Yes Minister treatment, that they were going to be run around by a Conservative public service. But there's a danger in responsiveness working only one way. And Laura Tingle, writing in the Financial Review some time ago, said that the federal public service, Commonwealth Public Service, has become very responsive to government and it will act when prodded by the executive. But there's no responsiveness the other way. That is, the public service no longer comes to government in the way the water authorities did with you, Jeff Gallop, in Western Australia, comes to government with ideas and prods the executive. Now, prods the executive into action on good policy. Peter Shergold, you've been there. Is that a fair comment by Laura Tingle?
No, I think it's complete poppycock, actually. I mean, I think one of the things that does distinguish the difference between ourselves and the United States is that in Australia you have a professional public service which to a very large extent, to the most senior levels, is there to serve successive governments with equal commitment. But it does serve governments. It doesn't serve oppositions, and it only serves parliaments in a certain specified way in terms of the provision of information. It serves successive governments, and I think that's what does Australia proud. The way we move from one government to another government, I think, is a model for democracies around the world. There is no pause. Now, I think that's very important, that you have public services which, in a confidential way, provide, I still think, frank and fearless and robust policy advice to ministers. The difficulty is, of course, that usually the media can't see it because of the way that it is done. I do not believe that, as Jeff has said, that public servants can't come forward on occasions with big issues, long-term issues, and win the interest of executive government in them. In fact, I think it happens to a remarkable extent. But it is important that public servants don't have a monopoly. I don't look back to the good old days when the Secretary or Director General of a department almost had a monopoly on the policy advice that went to ministers or premiers or prime ministers. I think it's a good thing that more people are now involved and able to influence the making of public policy. I think it's a good thing that I had to capture the ear of ministers or prime ministers. I think competition of ideas is valuable, but don't misunderstand that for saying that public servants don't continue to be influential in the way, in particular, they can put forward big long-term issues to the executive.
Natasha. Yeah.
I'm just curious, though, as to whether or not there is the perception, and I think there's a very strong argument to say that successive governments have actually put in place reforms and changes to ensure that the public service is more responsive to the political interest, sometimes more so than the public interest. This is not meant as a reflection on the public service, but on attempts by governments. And I think while there have been some attempts to make public service more responsive in some respects or efficient or whatever it may be, there are also the same reforms that may have had a deleterious effect on the independence of the private sector, so subjective remuneration or different methods of appointment, performance-based incentives for payment, but also, and I think this is where we come back to the debate about the role of ministers and particularly ministerial advisors, and that is an increased and more powerful role for ministerial staff in working, sometimes directing, liaising with departmental heads or other agents within the public service. And I think there's a real issue there in terms of accountability of ministerial staff that certainly the Hollow Men and maybe even Yes Minister exposes.
I think you're right. I think the accountability of ministerial staff, in the same way as their minister is accountable, is very important. I don't think in most jurisdictions or the Commonwealth the issue of remuneration is as a significant impact on the quality of advice being given by top public servants as it is in the private sector. I suppose the reform that's been most controversial at the Commonwealth level was the Keating government introducing contracts. So you move from being permanent secretaries to just secretaries. Now, my own view from witnessing is that I don't think it had a major impact on the vigour of the policy advice that was extended. But if there was one change that is most questionable, I suspect it is the fact that senior public servants have generally now moved on to contracts.
Agreed.
Alex Waddock, yeah.
Yes, I think, in fact, this trend may have begun before Keating with the Greiner government in New South Wales, and it's important, I think, to recognise that it's both sides of politics and it's also all levels of government. It's not just a Commonwealth phenomenon, it's states and territories as well, and I share the view, and I think it's widely held, that we have suffered from the public service becoming less independent and more politicised. And call me old-fashioned, but I would much prefer to have a less politicised, more independent public service. There may be costs of that as well. I think it is important, as we're all saying, that government does receive a plurality of advice, and that advice should also be from what we broadly would call the community, from community groups. Shouldn't just come from the public service. I think we've seen many, many examples where there has been a lot of wisdom in approaches that have been made outside the government process.
But I'm not sure that the solution to that problem would be to go back to a situation where we had a public service commission that appointed all of the senior executives in government. I was reminded recently, in fact, that that is still the situation in New Zealand. It's fascinating that their departmental heads are still chosen completely independently of the government of the day. I think this is an issue about the way leaders and the way governments operate. And the use of the word politicisation, I'm not even sure whether that would be the word I would use. I think politicisation is when governments interfere in tender processes, interfere in appointments down the line in the public service incorrectly.
Is that a subtle distinction, though?
Well, it is a subtle distinction, but how a government must be in control of its agenda.
But
must be in control of its agenda.
Let's take between these two kind of opposites, I suppose, where you might have the New Zealand example you gave, where there's a public service commission that appoints the heads of departments, and New South Wales, and this may have coloured Alex's comments, given that he comes from New South Wales, whereas my understanding is that the minister in the department appoints their own head of department. Now, that is a very close relationship, and I would suggest an inappropriate relationship, especially when there is no public service commission in New South Wales. And then you've got somewhere in between, which would be, Peter Shergold, the Commonwealth model, where senior public servants, heads of departments, are appointed by
the government, directly by the government.
By the government, but...
Well, yes, the head of PM&C provides advice to the Prime Minister, but it would be foolish to think that the head of the PM&C didn't talk to the Prime Minister in general terms about the sort of person that was being looked for. In most instances, I would come forward with a couple of names, hopefully someone within the Commonwealth Public Service and someone outside it to put forward suggestions. And then, when the Prime Minister has given it some thought, you then have to discuss it with the ministers. But clearly the Minister and the Prime Minister have a significant influence, as indeed, Jeff, they do in New Zealand. It's not quite the way. It is true you go through a process with the State Services Commissioner, but the State Services Commissioner puts forward a number of names, I think 2 ministers and the Prime Minister, from which they then select. So, and there needs to be some of that, because my experience, and in fact the Westminster system, I think, is based on a relationship of trust between the Minister and the senior public servant who serves them. Now, that doesn't mean they have to share political views. I very much doubt if the Prime Minister actually knew what my political views were in terms of party political views or how I voted. But you have to have a relationship of trust that the Minister or Prime Minister knows they can rely upon you 100%. And even if you've given advice which says that a policy, well, you wouldn't say it's stupid, you might say it's courageous in best Sir Humphrey, but even if you do that, if Cabinet then decides on that policy, it is absolutely appropriate that the government knows that you will go out as a public servant and do your best to implement it to government expectations 100%.